In the spring of 1475, the Burgundian army of Charles the Bold was locked in a major siege at Neuss, a fortified city on the Rhine. The Burgundians had been bombarding its walls and launching repeated attacks, but the defenders continued to hold their ground. Inside the city, food and supplies were running dangerously low. Then the situation changed. News arrived that an imperial army had captured Linz am Rhein, the final major strongpoint on the road toward Neuss. Emperor Friedrich III had made it clear that no territory belonging to the Holy Roman Empire could simply be taken away. His call to defend the empire brought an enormous response. Around 30,000 men were mobilized and began moving toward Neuss. But this army was very different from a modern professional force. The Holy Roman Empire did not have one permanent national army standing ready at all times. Instead, its military power came from a complicated network of obligations involving different parts of society. Nobles, knights, townspeople, rural communities, and mercenaries could all be called upon to serve, and each group had its own responsibilities. Nobles, knights, and the cost of war. One of the first groups ordered to provide soldiers were the empire's powerful princes, electors, dukes, margraves, and imperial counts. These rulers maintained large households containing people who performed many different roles, including administration, hunting, education, policing, ceremony, and military service. When war came, many of these men accompanied their lord into battle. Depending on their rank and wealth, some nobles were expected to provide mounted soldiers. Others, known as Einrusser, were required to appear personally with their own horse. These mounted men could serve as a lord's bodyguard and rapid response force. Their service could also bring considerable rewards, including wages, gifts, prestigious connections, offices, and land. But nobles were not the only people who could be summoned. A lord could also call upon his vassals and subjects. The exact requirements were usually laid out in an Anschlag, a document explaining why troops were being raised, how many men were needed, where they had to assemble, and what supplies or wagons they were expected to bring. Local officials known as Amtsmänner organized these forces within their administrative districts, known as Ämter. The financial burden of military service could be enormous. A knight such as Jan Puster zum Stein from Thuringia was called to arms in 1474 by the Elector of Saxony. His obligations included bringing himself, 3 armored mounted soldiers, a wagon with 4 horses, and enough infantry for his contingent. That wagon also had to carry equipment needed for fortifications and field defenses: chains, axes, hoes, picks, shovels, and planks. For a knight, the cost didn't stop there. He needed several horses, full plate armor, and enough money to pay the mounted men serving under him. Not every member of the lower nobility could afford that level of military service. In 1458, for example, 16 lesser nobles from Dresden shared their expenses and together provided only 4 mounted soldiers. Those who could no longer afford mounted service could instead enter the army as infantry. So even within the nobility, military obligations were closely tied to wealth. And the same principle would shape the military contributions of the towns, villages, and ordinary people who answered the emperor's call. The towns were another major source of military manpower in the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor, powerful princes, and other nobles could all depend on urban communities to strengthen their armies. By the late Middle Ages, the empire contained roughly 3,000 towns, ranging from small settlements to major cities. Among the most important were the approximately 100 free and imperial cities, including Nuremberg and Frankfurt on Main. These cities answered directly to the empire rather than to a local lord. Other towns, such as Dresden, Stuttgart, and Tübingen, remained under the authority of a territorial ruler and had less political independence. But regardless of their status, towns had an important military responsibility. Their inhabitants were expected to build and maintain walls, towers, and other defenses, and they had to man those fortifications when danger came. If the emperor or another ruler called for a campaign, citizens could also be required to leave their city and serve in the imperial army. However, not everyone living inside a medieval town was legally considered a citizen. Citizenship was connected to factors such as property and income. Those who possessed this status enjoyed important social and economic privileges and could participate in city politics. But those privileges came with obligations. Only around 15% of the urban population had full citizen status, and these people were expected to maintain military equipment according to their wealth and take part in the city's military levies. City officials regularly inspected their weapons and armor. These inspections, known as Harnischrüttel, provide historians with valuable evidence about the composition of medieval urban militias. Poorly maintained or missing equipment could result in fines. Wealthy merchants and master craftsmen from powerful families could sometimes resemble members of the nobility in military terms. They might own full plate armor and could be expected to equip or hire additional men for a campaign. At the other end of the scale were ordinary craftsmen.
A simpler citizen soldier might be expected to possess a jacket, helmet, breastplate, gloves, a pike, and another bladed weapon. Interestingly, surviving records occasionally mention women who owned military equipment. These women could be successful business owners or merchants, and once they reached a certain level of wealth, they could also be required to provide a man for military service. One pharmacist from Leipzig, for example, possessed enough equipment to outfit 2 soldiers. Journeymen, apprentices, and servants were usually in a different position. Because they often lacked enough property to meet the requirements for owning military equipment, their weapons could be supplied by their masters or by the city. And urban military contingents weren't made up entirely of fighters. When Frankfurt sent troops to the Imperial Army in 1475, its contingent also included cooks, butchers, wagon drivers, and servants. Guilds played an important role as well. They helped purchase weapons collectively and organize their members into military units. Cities were often divided into districts or wards, each under a captain. Officials could be assigned to handle finances, communicate with the city authorities, or even command troops directly. But there is one major mystery. We have far less evidence about how regularly these urban militias actually trained. Medieval towns certainly had a strong martial culture. Fencing schools existed in larger cities, while sword fighting and messer fighting became increasingly popular. Wrestling and boxing were also practiced. Shooting competitions were especially important. Townspeople competed with crossbows and increasingly with hand cannons, with cities offering prizes, food, wine, and beer to attract participants. These competitions helped improve weapon skills and physical fitness. But whether city militias regularly practiced coordinated battlefield formations is much less certain. Only one clear example from Erfurt in 1447 describes townspeople and nearby rural residents practicing the construction and defense of a wagon fort. The source itself suggests that this was an unusual event. And that raises an important question. How effective were these militias when they actually entered a battlefield? Sometimes they performed surprisingly well against noble troops, but other records reveal serious problems with discipline. During the Second War of the Cities in 1449-1450, Nuremberg's militia and its mercenaries were reportedly arriving for inspections with poor equipment and little enthusiasm. Some handgunners even fired their weapons from the walls simply to make noise rather than to hit meaningful targets. Things did not necessarily improve once they left the city. One report describes soldiers wandering away to chase geese and chickens, while their captains struggled to keep them together. Even during the return march, the formation broke apart well before they reached the city. The urban militia, therefore, was a powerful but unpredictable part of the empire's military system.
The countryside was just as important to the military system as the towns and the nobility. There is a common image of medieval peasants as helpless people with no connection to warfare, but in the Holy Roman Empire, that picture doesn't tell the whole story. Rural communities were an important part of the empire's military organization. At the top of village society were the Bauern, or farmers, who owned substantial farms and could generate significant incomes. Some were wealthy enough to stand on a level comparable to members of the lower nobility. Below them were farmhands, maidservants, and day laborers. These wealthier farmers were not simply agricultural workers. They could have political influence within their communities, and in many parts of the empire, participated in regional politics alongside nobles and towns. But political responsibilities also came with military duties. Under a system known as Gerichtsfolge, peasants and their servants could be required to pursue and arrest criminals within their local district. That might mean chasing thieves, capturing nobles involved in feuds, or even attacking fugitives who had barricaded themselves inside farms, churches, or castles. In other words, some rural communities were effectively performing armed policing and peacekeeping. And when war came, villages could become part of their lord's military plans. Under Landfolge, a system originally intended mainly for regional defense, rural communities could eventually be called upon to participate in military campaigns. They were expected to appear armed and, depending on their wealth, could also have to provide servants, carts, horses, and other animals needed for transportation and labor. So what did these rural soldiers actually look like? Muster rolls and instructions from local rulers give us some clues. Just like townspeople, people living in the countryside were expected to maintain weapons, and those weapons could be inspected periodically. Equipment had to be kept in usable condition. Simply borrowing weapons for an inspection was specifically forbidden. Some villages even kept shared weapons so that poorer residents could be equipped when necessary. A rural levy from Kleingrabe, for example, included men with very different levels of equipment. One man, Walter Erfurt, appeared with a helmet, chainmail, a shorts, a jacket, and a crossbow. Another man, Hans Heisse, had only a jacket. Other records reveal that crossbows and hand cannons were common among rural troops. They could also carry swords, maces, spears, flails, axes, and hatchets. And carts were likely another important part of their military contribution. Training is harder to document, but rural communities did have their own martial traditions. Activities such as wrestling, sword dances, and shooting festivals gave villagers opportunities to practice physical skills and weapons, including crossbows and firearms. When these people went on campaign, not everyone fought directly. Farmhands could look after animals, assist their masters, build camp defenses, perform digging and entrenchment work, and transport baggage.
Like nobles and townspeople, rural men could organize themselves according to their village, amt, or court district, and their military role extended beyond major battles. They could become involved in what sources described as the tägliche Krieg, or everyday warfare, raiding, looting, cattle theft, protection payments, and smaller clashes. This could be extremely dangerous. During the Second War of the Cities in 1449-1450, forces operating around Nuremberg frequently encountered heavily armed villagers while attempting to raid rural settlements. When threatened, villagers could retreat into fortified churches and fire hand cannons from church towers. Even the forces of Charles the Bold encountered fierce resistance from rural inhabitants. The Burgundian chronicler John Molinet described peasants taking up weapons against soldiers searching for food and supplies. Villagers could set traps and inflict serious casualties on enemy troops. So the medieval village was not necessarily an easy target. For an army moving through the countryside, an apparently ordinary settlement could quickly become a dangerous defensive position. The final group in this military system was the mercenaries. They are difficult to classify because medieval society was not as rigid as it is sometimes portrayed. People could move between social groups and enter military service for many different reasons. A mercenary could come from almost any background. For some members of the lower nobility, military service for hire was a practical way to survive financially. Their upbringing had prepared them to fight and ride horses, but maintaining a noble lifestyle could be expensive. Serving different lords as professional soldiers could therefore become a profitable career, especially when successful campaigns offered opportunities for additional spoils. Some lesser nobles went even further and became military contractors, recruiting soldiers for rulers when a war broke out. Their noble connections, military experience, and personal networks made them well suited to this role. But mercenary forces were not limited to nobles. Burghers and ordinary city residents could also join them. One example is the Augsburg chronicler Burkhard Zink. In his 20s, Zink left Augsburg and joined 24 journeymen who were supporting Rodweil during its war against the Lord of Zollern. Because of his education, Zink became the group's scribe and paymaster. Over 10 months, he earned 30 guilders. Others came from the poorer sections of urban society. Many had little or no armor, partly because equipment belonging to their guilds was often not allowed to leave the city. Instead, these men frequently served as gunners or crossbowmen, where having large numbers of troops could matter more than expensive personal equipment. Some urban mercenaries also took on longer-term responsibilities for their cities. They could perform policing, administrative, and military duties, and in some places they even formed brotherhoods that became part of normal urban society. So the medieval mercenary was not necessarily the wandering professional soldier often imagined today. Mercenary service could be a temporary occupation, a financial necessity, or a long-term military career, and the people entering it could come from very different levels of society. Why the imperial system worked. As the imperial army moved toward Neuss, it brought together far more than soldiers and weapons. It brought together the different social groups that made up the Holy Roman Empire. The empire did not depend on a single permanent standing army. Instead, its military strength came from a complicated system of obligations, privileges, wealth, and negotiation. Armored nobles and their retinues provided mounted troops. Towns supplied organized militias and supporting personnel. Rural communities contributed armed men, labor, transport, and local defense. And mercenaries filled additional military roles, drawing recruits from several parts of society. The relief of Neuss demonstrated something important. Despite being politically fragmented, the Holy Roman Empire could still mobilize enormous resources when its territorial integrity was threatened. The army gathering before Neuss was more than a collection of soldiers. It was a reflection of the empire itself, diverse, fragmented, and complicated, yet capable of coming together when it mattered most. Before the imperial army marched toward Neuss, it is important to understand why the city had become the center of a major conflict. The siege was part of a struggle known as the Cologne Chapter Feud. The crisis began after the death of Archbishop Dietrich II of Moors on February 14, 1463. As Archbishop of Cologne, Dietrich had been one of the most powerful figures in the Holy Roman Empire. He was also an elector, giving a vote in the election of the Roman king. At the same time, he ruled the territories belonging to the Electorate of Cologne and other associated lands. Throughout his career, Dietrich had pursued an ambitious policy of expanding his regional power, but those ambitions came at a tremendous financial cost. After his death, the estates within his territory formed an alliance known as the Erblon-Feinigiger. This alliance included the Cathedral Chapter, the city of Cologne, other towns within the archdiocese, counts, and knights. Their message was clear. They would not accept a new ruler unless he respected their existing rights and privileges. They also demanded a say in major political decisions. Taxes, declarations of war, and other important matters would require their approval. In effect, they were attempting to limit the secular power of the Archbishop. Dietrich's successor, Archbishop Ruprecht of the Palatine, initially accepted these conditions, but that agreement did not last. Rupert began recruiting mercenaries and attempted to force territories that had pledged themselves to the alliance back under his authority. He also introduced new taxes, including a poll tax and a household tax. Then he took the conflict even further. Rupert laid siege to the city of Neuss. The estates responded by invoking their right of resistance under the agreement. They deposed Rupert as their secular ruler and appointed Hermann of Hesse to administer the archbishop. Rupert, however, refused to accept his removal. He gathered allies and began making military threats. The dispute was rapidly turning into something much more dangerous, a civil war within the archbishop. And among Rupert's allies was one of the most ambitious rulers in Europe, Charles the Bold of Burgundy. Charles had his own plans for expanding his territory and transforming his duchy into a kingdom. For some time he had been interested in parts of the Archbishop of Cologne, because controlling them would help strengthen and consolidate his possessions. Representatives from the opposing sides eventually met in Trier, hoping to resolve the dispute peacefully, but the negotiations failed. Charles the Bold, supported by Friedrich the Victorious and troops from the duchies of Gelders and Cleves, moved into the Rhineland. The Burgundian army eventually turned toward Neuss, and what had begun as a political dispute over rights, taxes, and authority was now becoming a major military confrontation. The walls of Neuss would soon face one of the most powerful armies of the late medieval period, and the Holy Roman Empire would have to decide whether it was willing and able to come to the city's aid.